Before we begin, take a deep breath and let the noise of the day slowly fade. Clench your jaw, soften your eyes, and let the weight of modern life melt away. Tonight, we're not chasing action or drama. We're wandering into the forgotten corridors of boring history, where medieval echoes linger and dark tales unfold like fading ink on parchment. Welcome to Midnight Sleepless, a resting place for tired minds, for the Middle Ages, ancient empires, and strange, dark history. Stories drift by like soft clouds. Here, knights, castles, and quiet empires return not with a roar, but with a whisper. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there, okay? And if you enjoy these slow, sleepy journeys through medieval times, boring facts, and forgotten worlds, okay? Gentle tap on the subscribe button helps keep this calm storytelling alive. Now, let the story begin in the deepest corner of the royal kitchens, far from the banquets and bright laughter of gilded halls. There was a place where steam rose in thick clouds, and the air was heavy with the smell of broth, lye, and iron. This was the scullery, a world unto itself, hidden beneath tapestries and marble, where no candlelight was meant to flatter and no music was played to please. It was a place where pots, worn smooth by years of boiling and scraping, whispered of queens more than any gilded throne did. For here, in the rhythm of water and metal, the true pulse of the palace could be heard. The scullery boys rose long before the first chambermaid lit her candle. They came with sleep still clinging to their eyes, feet dragging across stone, but hands already remembering their endless work. The great copper pots, too heavy for one pair of shoulders, needed lifting, draining, scrubbing. Cold water numbed fingers until the skin cracked and lye burned into cuts that no balm would heal. Yet the boys carried on, voices hushed in the damp air, for silence had long become the first rule of this underground order. Words were few, gestures were everything, passing a brush, tilting a pan, lifting a pan, just so. What need was there for talk when the clatter of ladles and the sigh of steam were language enough? In the scullery, rank and title dissolved like salt in water. Whether a boy born to a farmer or a girl whose mother had once minted lace for a noble, all hands were equally raw, equally soiled. Yet still, hierarchy existed in its own secret form. The oldest among them, those who had scrubbed longest, carried an authority as unspoken as the queen's presence above them. They knew which stains could be lifted with sand and which must be endured. They knew how to silence the squeal of a kettle lid or balance a heavy cauldron without spilling its treasure. To serve in the scullery was to learn a craft as disciplined as any knight's. Though no trumpet ever sounded in its honor, every pan bore its own memory. And in the hush of their work, the scullery folk sometimes fancied they could hear the tales the metal carried. A dented pot might murmur of a wedding feast where doves were served in pastry. A soot-stained cauldron might recall the hunger years when thin gruel was stretched to fill bowls for every servant, and the gleaming copper basin, polished until one could almost see the crown reflected in it, carried whispers of queens who demanded sauces so rich they could drown a kingdom, queens who refused a dish for being too cool by a breath, queens who never once descended to see the army of hands that made their splendor possible. Pots spoke where mouths were silent, carrying both reverence and resentment in their unyielding walls. The rhythm of scullery life was steady as tides. At dawn, kettles roared, their bellies filled with water hauled in wooden buckets, sloshing down the boys' tunics. By midday, the scraps of banquets arrived, bones with morsels of meat, crusts of bread, too stale for the court, fish heads, and wilted greens. These were boiled down for servant stews, the broth rising fragrant though, born of what nobility deemed unworthy. At dusk, when the palace glittered with torchlight and the queen's guests raised jeweled goblets, The scullery toiled over piles of greasy trenches, the rushes beneath their feet slippery with waste. Their world was not one of pageantry, but of endurance. No court chronicler recorded their names, but without their unseen order, the palace would have reeked of rot in days. It was not only food that passed through the scullery, but secrets as well. Silver platters carried to and from feasts often bore not only crumbs, but overheard whispers. A page might, in careless chatter, mention a noble's fall from favor. A steward, too weary to guard his tongue, might murmur of debts or alliances. These words clung like grease, seeping into the scullery along with the dishes. The workers there, invisible as shadows, learned to keep such knowledge hidden, polishing it away with the same precision as they did the pewter plates. Yet, in their private thoughts, they wove together these fragments. And so the scullery often knew more of the true state of the realm than those seated at the banqueting tables. The pots whispered, yes, but so too did the silence of the servants. There was, within the dankness and fatigue, a strange kind of pride. To make a kettle shine so bright it rivaled a noble's mirror was a triumph. To master the angle of a brush so that grease yielded to water without leaving a trace was to wield a skill invisible but indispensable. Their labor was not celebrated, but it was essential, and deep down they knew it. The queen might reign over silks and courtiers, but it was their hands that kept the order of her world intact. The grandeur above would collapse into filth without the quiet constancy of those below. At times, exhaustion broke through this fragile dignity. A boy would drop a ladle and earn a scalding rebuke from the head cook. A girl, wrists trembling under the weight of a cauldron, might weep when no one was looking. Yet even in these moments, there was solidarity. Someone would lift a pot alongside her. Someone else would cover the mistake with quick hands. They had no noble titles to bind them, but they were bound by necessity, by toil shared in the dim light of the scullery lamps. That bond was quiet, but it was unbreakable. Seasons passed, and the scullery shifted with them. In winter, the breath of every worker mingled with the steam, creating a fog so thick it blurred faces into ghosts. In summer, the heat grew unbearable, sweat stinging eyes, as if the very air were punishment. The work never eased. The pots whispered on, recording not the triumphs of kings, but the endless cycle of hunger, preparation, waste, and renewal. And, in the endlessness of it, there was a strange echo of eternity. Just as monarchs rose and fell, wars flared and faded, dynasties bloomed and withered, the scullery endured unchanged, its order quiet but constant. Some among them dreamed of more. A boy might hope to rise to the kitchen's proper, perhaps to apprentice, under a cook who could earn the queen's favor. A girl might pray for marriage that would lift her from stone floors and steaming vats. But most knew that their place was fixed as surely as the soot upon the walls. And so, rather than dreaming upward, they found meaning sideways in the camaraderie of shared toil, in the rhythm of brushes against iron, in the faint sweetness of broth salvaged from scraps. These small triumphs were their crowns, their jewels, polished not for show but for survival. On rare occasions, a queen herself would pass through, perhaps in some fit of curiosity, or during a moment of grand inspection. The workers would freeze, their bodies rigid, their heads bowed, water dripping from brushes held midair. The queen would sweep through, trailing perfume and authority, her eyes scarcely glancing at the grime or the burns etched into their skin. For her, it was a place of otherness, a realm beneath notice. But for those who lived it daily, it was the very heart of survival. When she left, the air seemed heavier, and the pots whispered louder, as though they carried away the memory of her presence, folding it into their endless tales as years wore on. Scullery workers came and went, their places filled by new hands, but the order remained unbroken. Pots and pans outlived them all, growing older, darker, heavier with memory. A basin that had once been scrubbed by a boy long dead was still in use, still whispering its tale into the ears of those who came after. In this way, the scullery kept its own history, silent but enduring, written not in ink but in steam and grease, in the shine of metal restored again and again. The workers might leave no mark upon the annals of the court, but the scullery itself remembered them in its quiet order. And so the palace above sparkled, its floors polished, its banquets resplendent, its queens remembered in portraits and tapestries. But beneath it all, in the damp corners where light faltered, the scullery whispered its own truths. The pots carried the weight of unseen hands, of hunger and hope, of toil without recognition. They whispered of queens, yes, but also of those who scrubbed and scoured until their very lives were spent in service. Callery was not a place of glory, but it was a place of permanence. Long after queens were gone, the whisper of the pots remained, steady as breath, eternal as labor. The faintest light of morning always crept into the chambers, long before the first member of the royal family stirred. And it was in that hour of pale silence that her work began. She had no name in the gilded records, no face etched into the tapestries that told the kingdom's stories, yet her hands shaped the rhythm of each royal dawn. The palace itself still slumbered, its stone walls cool, its corridors quiet, save for the distant flicker of torches and the soft murmur of guards, changing watch. She had learned to breathe with the silence, to move with it, to become invisible in the way only servants could manage. The hour before waking was not hers, and never had been. It belonged to the family that slept above, behind velvet curtains, wrapped in silks imported from lands she would never see. Her feet pressed gently into the chilled stone floors as she rose, careful not to disturb even the other servants in their shared quarters. The wooden frame of her bed groaned faintly, and she froze, listening for any stir of complaint from her companions. No one moved, so she bent to lace her worn shoes and gathered the apron she had folded neatly the night before. The palace might rise with gold, but her day began with cold water against her hands. A rush of it poured from the cisterns into basins, her breath misting in the dim kitchens where she first reported. Buckets, brass kettles, and coals waited for her touch. She had long ago learned that fire did not spring to life with one strike. It coaxed, it resisted, it flared, it sulked. Waking the hearth before the king or queen ever opened their eyes was the truest ritual of her mornings. The flames had to be fed slowly, carefully, until they crackled with strength enough to boil the water for tea and warm the first loaves of bread. The bakers, heavy-handed and flour-dusted, came later. She worked before them, laying out cloths, fetching the eggs, the jars of preserved fruit, the wines that would be mixed into sauces or warmed for the children's morning drink. It was not hers to decide what the royal family ate, but it was her burden to make sure every piece was in its place. One spoon misplaced, one vessel cracked, and the steward's eyes would narrow on her like knives. She had learned the pattern of reprimands, the quiet venom of words whispered in corridors where she could not defend herself. She did not want those words this morning, nor any morning. Silence was her armor, obedience her shield by the time the fires held steady. Her arms ached faintly from carrying water and wood, and her skirts were damp at the hem. She never thought to change them. There was no time. She moved swiftly to the royal chambers, her steps measured so that no echo carried through the halls. Curtains were drawn back in the faintest rustle, shutters unlatched to let in the new day's air. The scent of wax and lavender oil lingered, mixed with the faint odor of feathers in the mattresses and the warmth of bodies still cocooned in slumber. She dared not look directly at the sleeping figures. They were not hers to see, though every curve of the rooms, every shimmer of gold, every embroidered pillow was etched into her memory. She knew the exact angle at which to tilt the basin of water so the light would catch its surface when the queen first opened her eyes. She knew the temperature at which the king's morning wash must be presented, neither too cold nor too warm, or else irritation would ripple through the entire household. There was a rhythm to it, one learned through quiet repetition year after year. The servants lived by these rhythms, though their names never made it into the histories. She knew the prince favored rising slowly, asking for the shutters to remain partly closed until he finished his prayers. She knew the youngest princess often whispered to her doll before acknowledging the governess, her hair tangled, her eyes heavy. She knew the queen would often wake before the king, but never let her body stir until he did, out of ritual, out of custom, out of something unseen but rigidly obeyed. She, the servant, slipped between these habits like a shadow, smoothing sheets, laying slippers on the floor, arranging the smallest details of garments to be worn that day. Her hands, roughened from lion water, were careful when they touched the fabrics. Silks that hissed faintly when folded, velvet that drank in the light, woolen undergarments that clung to warmth, each was lifted with reverence. She never owned such cloth, not even a scrap. Her dresses were patched, coarse, their colors dulled by repeated washings, yet she touched their garments with tenderness, as if in service to the fabric itself, as if it might speak of her care, even if no human voice did. She often thought of this, though never aloud. How many hands had worked to weave, dye, and embroider these clothes? How many lives had pressed into their making, only to be discarded in memory once their threads were worn thin? Her own labor belonged to the same silence. When the bells of the chapel sounded faintly across the courtyard, she knew the moment had come. The household shifted. Footsteps multiplied in the corridors. Voices murmured. The governesses arrived to rouse the children. The steward appeared to oversee the final setting of trays, and the guards straightened their postures outside the doors. Her part of the dawn was nearly over. She would fade back unseen as the family sat to break their fast. Her hands, however, bore the traces of all that unseen effort. A faint burn from a coal, a sting of cold water, the dry crack at her knuckle. From scrubbing too often. No one saw these marks. No one asked, and she did not expect them to. There was a dignity in it, nonetheless. She told herself that as she collected the used linens from the washing pile, as she bent once again over the great wooden basins later that morning, the queen's laughter might drift faintly through the open window. The clatter of knives and forks might echo in distant halls, but here she worked in rhythm with water and cloth. She beat the stains with careful strikes. She wrung out the fabric until her wrists ached. She hung them where the sun might dry them. Dawn had already passed for the royals, but for her it stretched on, repeating itself in cycles of labor that no clock truly marked. At times she thought of her mother, who had served in another great house, and her grandmother, who had done the same. Their names had not been remembered either, but their hands had shaped mornings for others, just as hers now did. Perhaps one day her daughter, if she had one, would carry the same burden. Perhaps the rhythm of dawn belonged not to the royals at all, but to the nameless servants who rose first, who lit the fires, who pulled back the curtains so that others might bask in the sun. The thought gave her a quiet strength, though she never dared let it show. As the day wore forward, her presence dissolved among the tasks of dozens of others. She became one thread in a tapestry woven of footsteps, whispers, and chores. When she closed her eyes at night, long after the candles in the royal chambers had been extinguished, she could still feel that first hour of dawn upon her hands. It was a weight and a calling, invisible yet unyielding, promise she fulfilled every morning before the royal family stirred. Would you like me to expand this into a full 1,500+ word immersive story with more detail on her inner reflections, the palace routines, and how dawn looked and felt through her eyes each day. The sun had not yet risen above the turrets of Windsor, when the faint stirrings of labor began in the quieter wings of the great castle. The royal family still slept, their chambers wrapped in hush and velvet, but in the laundry quarters life was already awake. The air carried a damp chill, the kind that clung to cloth, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the stone passages, as if reminding those within that their day would belong to the rhythm of soaking, scrubbing, and wringing. Washing day came with its own sort of ceremony, one that was not gilded with jewels or parades, but woven instead with the steady gestures of hands in water, the whisper of linen, and the quiet pride of those who made whiteness itself their craft. Women who filed into the laundry rooms knew their tasks before words were spoken. The younger ones moved quickly, fetching buckets and kindling the fires beneath the great coppers that would heat the wash. Steam rose almost at once, filling the vaulted room with a mist that blurred the outlines of stone walls and made the whole space feel closer, more intimate, as though the castle's grandeur had softened for a while into the warmth of domestic toil. Older women, with sleeves rolled back and aprons already damp from habit, took the baskets of soiled linen sheets, tablecloths, handkerchiefs, cleats, and undergarment sand, spread them out upon the wooden benches to judge which needed soaking, which demanded lye, and which could be scoured with simple soap and water. It was not ordinary linen they handled. The cloth had brushed against the skin of queens, sorbed the perfume of courtiers, lain upon the tables where diplomats feasted, cloaked the daily life of the highest in the land. Yet here, stripped of context, it was simply fabric kneading. Care, stained as any fabric would be, subject to the same quiet laws of dirt and cleansing. There was a dignity in that leveling, and the women knew it. Though they seldom spoke of it aloud, the soundscape of the laundry was its own kind of music. The crackle of wood beneath the coppers set the rhythm, while the splash of garments sinking into water gave it a refrain. The beat of wooden bats upon linen provided percussion, echoing like muted drums through the halls. Laughter sometimes joined, low and knowing, as women leaned over their work and shared fragments of gossip, little morsels of courtly life, overheard or imagined. Yet the gossip never fully overtook the labor. The hands kept moving, wrists turning with instinctive ease, muscles pulling in practiced arcs. To wash royal linen was both ordinary and extraordinary in intimate connection to grandeur, carried out in silence and suds as the day lengthened. The work shifted from the damp heaviness of scrubbing to the more delicate art of rinsing and wringing. Buckets of clean water, fetched from the castle wells, were poured out in steady cascades, leaving the stone floors slick with rivulets. Strong arms twisted fabric until it yielded streams of water, the women's knuckles whitening with the pressure. The linen grew lighter then, pliable, almost like a living thing surrendering its impurities and stretching toward purity again. To those who did the work, it was not just cleanliness, it was restoration, return of the cloth to its rightful dignity. Out in the courtyards, long ropes were strung, and wooden poles lifted high for the drying. The castle, often thought of in terms of battle and ceremony, became for a day a forest of linens. Sheets billowed like sails against the wind, banners of domestic conquest flapping between towers and walls. The sight was both practical and strangely beautiful, a reminder that beneath the splendor of monarchy lay the human fabric of maintenance and care. Visitors who glimpsed it from afar might have thought the castle itself was dressed in white, its stones softened by the flutter of cloth. Drying was only half the art. Once the fabrics were lifted down, their surfaces crisp with sun and air, the real patience began. Ironing demanded steady hands and heat controlled with precision. Heavy irons, warmed upon the fire, were passed across the linen with deliberate weight, smoothing wrinkles and pressing out the memory of water. The women leaned into the work, bodies swaying with the rhythm of pressure and release, careful not to scorch. A fine handkerchief might demand more tenderness than a grand tablecloth, but each piece received its due attention. What emerged was not simply cloth, but cloth reborn white, smooth, immaculate, fit once more to touch royal skin or grace royal chambers. The youngest among them often marveled at this transformation. A sheet that entered their hands, limp and blemished, emerged shining, its texture softened into something close to silk, its edges sharp and defined. The older women, though long accustomed, still felt a muted satisfaction each time they stacked a pile of freshly pressed linen. The neat folds, like pages of a silent book, telling the story of their labor. They knew that no one in the court would speak of their work at the grand feasts or in the whispered councils of state. But still, they folded each piece as if the world would pause to admire it. There were quiet rituals embedded in the day, passed down through memory rather than written instruction. A small prayer muttered before plunging the first sheet into boiling water meant less for piety than for the rhythm of beginning. A habit of sprinkling lavender between folded layers to carry a hint of fragrance into royal chambers. Stowaway. A certain woman always folded napkins into triangles, though squares were easier to stack. These gestures gave the labor texture, as though each act of care were stitched with personal devotion. Evening brought with it a different kind of silence. The baskets, once heavy with soiled linen, stood empty. The lines in the courtyard sagged, now bare and quiet. Within the laundry rooms, the last of the steam drifted upward, vanishing into the rafters as fires dwindled. Hands were raw and reddened, sleeves stiff with damp, yet the women felt a certain fullness, as though the whiteness of the folded stacks reflected back upon them. The castle above them would glow that night with candlelight, and no guest would give a thought to the sheets beneath their heads or the tablecloth beneath their feast. But the women knew, and in that knowledge lay a pride as enduring as stone. Washing day at Windsor was not a day of spectacle, yet it held a quiet grandeur all its own. It was the grandeur of rhythm, of ordinary labor performed with extraordinary care, of human touch woven into the fabric of royal life. The castle's history would be written in battles, marriages, and treaties. But somewhere within its unrecorded memory lay the soft flutter of linen in the courtyard, the hiss of hot iron upon cloth, the laughter of women over steaming coppers. That, too, was Windsor, and without it, the splendor above could never have been sustained. In the deep belly of the palace, where light from the tall windows never reached, there lay a room filled with the low hiss of boiling water, the faint crack of starch stiffening in the heat, and the soft sigh of fabric as it dried. The royal laundry room was a place of endless work, yet little was ever spoken of it in the grand halls above. Those who labored there moved in a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely graceful, as if each action was stitched into the invisible fabric of the monarchy itself. At dawn, before the royal family stirred from their feathered beds, the laundresses had already begun their day. Buckets of water were hauled from the kitchens and boiled in great copper vats. Steam filled the room, curling against the dark beams of the ceiling, making the walls weep with condensation. The air was heavy, scented with lye soap, damp linen, and the faint sweetness of crushed herbs used to perfume the fabrics. Though the work was backbreaking, there was dignity in the craft. For each fold of silk and each length of lace carried not only beauty but also the unspoken power of appearance. The garments of kings and queens were not mere clothes, they were declarations. A doublet smoothed to perfection, a gown pressed into gleaming folds, a lace cuff free of stains all spoke of majesty, control, and refinement. Yet behind this shining surface were hands raw from water and soap, fingers rubbed thin by fabric, and arms aching from endless wringing. One could almost measure the rhythm of the kingdom by the laundry. After a royal banquet, the laundry room filled with stained napkins, wine-splashed gowns, and crumpled tablecloths. After a hunt, there came muddy breeches, bloodied gloves, and cloaks smelling of the forest. After ceremonies, the room drowned in velvets heavy with sweat, stiff brocades, and lace collars dulled with powder and perfume. Each event above meant another tide of work below. The laundresses had their own hierarchy, subtle but strict. The eldest women, whose bodies were bent from decades of lifting and scrubbing, supervised with quiet authority. They alone handled the most delicate fabrics, the silks and satins that could be ruined with a single careless touch. Younger women tended to the heavier work hauling, scrubbing, beating the coarser linens against wooden boards. Apprentices, often little more than girls, learned by watching, their small hands trembling as they dared to smooth lace cuffs with heated irons. The irons themselves were tools of both precision and danger. Made of heavy metal, they were heated directly in the fire, glowing faintly when pulled out. A laundress would test the heat by holding it close to her cheek or flicking a drop of water on its surface. Too hot, and the fabric could scorch. Too cool, and the folds would never hold. They pressed in silence, the only sound the faint sizzle of steam and the slow scrape of metal against cloth. Folding was its own art. Silk could not be creased too sharply, for the lines would mar its shimmer. Lace had to be laid out as though it were fragile snow, each loop untangled, each scallop coaxed into shape. Linen was folded with geometric precision, the corners meeting perfectly so that when laid in the royal chambers, the impression was one of effortless order. The laundresses knew that the smallest imperfection could bring reprimand. A crooked fold might mean shame, a stray stain might mean dismissal, and yet, despite the fear of mistakes, there was pride. Pride in seeing the queen's gown fall in radiant folds, knowing that their hands had coaxed the silk into such grace. Pride in the king's cuffs, gleaming white against his doublet, whitened by their hours of scrubbing. Their labor clothed the monarchy and dignity. Without them, majesty would appear unkempt, fragile, and human. But no one applauded them. No one looked down from the golden thrones to see the damp, red-knuckled hands that had prepared the splendor. Their reward was silence, perhaps a muttered acknowledgment from a steward, but more often nothing at all. The grandeur of the court washed through their hands and left them invisible. Evenings in the laundry room carried their own rhythm. As the palace above feasted or danced, the women gathered around long tables, mending small tears, reattaching buttons, reinforcing seams. A gown might glitter in candlelight, but beneath its surface it bore the quiet strength of their stitching. The air was cooler then, though still scented with starch and soap. Laughter sometimes broke the monotony, muted stories of lives lived in the shadows. Some spoke of children left in villages far away, others of small loves hidden among the servants. Their voices wove through the fabric like threads, fragile but enduring. Seasons changed, and the laundry bore witness to it. Winter brought heavy furs lined with satin, cumbersome to clean and slow to dry. Summer filled the room with lighter linens, but also the overwhelming sweat and stains of heat. Rain meant muddy hems. Snow meant damp cloaks thawing by the fire. The garments told the story of the year as clearly as any chronicle, though only those in the laundry room could read it. Sometimes the women would touch the silks and wonder what it felt like to wear them. They imagined the weight of a gown swaying at a dance, the way lace might brush against the wrist, the sheen of jewels threaded through embroidery. For a fleeting moment, as they smoothed the fabric, they almost felt themselves part of that other world, but only almost. The garment always left their hands to ascend the stairs. never to return until soiled, heavy, gay, and stained again. The laundry room was a cycle of transformation. Stains vanished, wrinkles surrendered, disorder became order. The work was endless, yet each piece carried the quiet satisfaction of renewal. In their own way, the laundresses preserved the illusion of perfection, renewing it day after day. It was said among them that the palace could not breathe without the laundry. What use was a royal ball if gowns sagged or collars hung limp? Use was a banquet if tablecloths smelled of old wine. The kingdom might run on gold and armies, but its elegance was woven and washed below the ground when the day ended. The laundresses did not step into finery or feasts. They left with clothes damp from steam, hair clinging to their foreheads, hands rough and raw. Yet they carried with them a knowledge unspoken that the splendor above depended on their labor below. While kings signed decrees and queens offered smiles, it was they who brushed silk, folded lace, and guarded the secret dignity of the monarchy in the silence of the laundry room. With its steam rising like faint ghosts and its fabrics glowing faintly in the dim lamplight, they worked as if time itself depended on their touch. They were never seen, rarely thanked, and always forgotten. Yet with every fold, every stitch, every press of an iron, they left their quiet mark upon history, written not in ink, but in fabric, not in words, but in the sheen of silks smoothed by weary, steady hands. In the vast expanse of a royal palace, where the weight of crowns and the echo of power seemed to linger in every chamber, there lived a quieter world, hidden in the shadows of brocade curtains and beneath the gilded ceilings. It was the world of the palace maids, whose lives were measured not in proclamations or ceremonies, but in the soft tug of a bell pull, in the muffled shuffle of slippered feet across waxed floors. Their work, invisible and constant, wove together the fabric of court life. Code no chronicler thought to inscribe their names. The palace itself was a living organism, its walls breathing with secrets, its corridors carrying the scents of roasting meats, beeswax polish, and perfumes so rare they could be traced only to distant harbors. Yet its heart beat with a rhythm dictated by the smallest of gestures, the bell pulls. Velvet cords dangled in drawing rooms, behind canopy beds, near carved mantels. At a moment's whim, a noblewoman might tug one, summoning assistance. To the mistress, it was a simple act, as natural as lifting a fan. To the maid, however, that tug was a summons as powerful as any trumpet call to war. The bells themselves were hidden in the service corridors, their shrill little chimes assigned two different wings of the palace. Maids learned to know them by sound alone. The north gallery bell was deeper, a little rattled with age. The small drawing-room bell had a sharp, impatient note. A girl who failed to recognize the correct bell could find herself facing sharp reprimand or even dismissal. And so, even as they polished silver or bent low over linen sheets, the maids kept one ear pricked toward the bells, ready to spring into silence. Footsteps carried them through the unseen arteries of the palace. They knew which stairs creaked, which corridors echoed, which corners required a hand pressed against the wall to steady a tray laden with porcelain. Their gait was practiced into invisibility, swift but not rushed, soft but never hesitant. To walk noisily in the grand gallery, where lords conversed in silk and feathered hats, was unthinkable. A maid's passage must be like air, present but unmarked. Even the rustle of skirts was managed, hems tucked slightly upward to minimize sound. It was said among them that the finest compliment was when a noblewoman, startled by a cough or bow, realized only then that her maid had been standing by the whole time. Morning was the busiest of hours. Before the royal family stirred, maids had already lit fires in chambers, coaxing flame from flint and tinder with hands that bore the fine scars of ash. Fires meant warmth, and warmth meant comfort. Yet these flames were never allowed to betray their keepers. By the time the queen's ladies swept into her chamber, the hearth was already crackling, and the maid who had crouched to build it had vanished, leaving only the faint smell of charred wood. Beds needed smoothing, chamber pots discreetly carried away, water pitchers filled fresh from the cistern. Each task had to be finished before the royal feet touched the ground. To be seen lingering was to risk a sharp remark, or worse, a dismissal that meant leaving the palace walls and returning to the uncertainty of village life. And so the maids moved quickly, efficiently, their work always timed to the rising of the household. Beyond daily labor lay the invisible art of observation. Palace maids became the keepers of secrets, whether they wished it or not. A letter left unsealed on a desk, a whispered quarrel carried through a half-open door, a tryst glimpsed in a shadowed gallery. Maids saw it all. Yet silence was their shield. To speak of such things, unless carefully traded in whispers to the right ears, was perilous. A careless remark could brand one as untrustworthy and banish her from service. But those who knew how to balance discretion with quiet hints to the proper superior could secure favor, and with favor came better placements, lighter duties, or the promise of a longer tenure within those walls. Meals carried their own rituals of unseen labor. Before the nobles ever dined, the maids and lower servants scurried in the underrooms, arranging trays, checking that goblets were polished, linens spotless. A dropped spoon could summon wrath if discovered upstairs. Trays of fruit gleamed like jewels, their arrangement calculated not just for taste, but for beauty. The maids carried these with hands steady as stone, climbing narrow servant staircases that spiraled into the light of great halls, where trumpets might sound and courtiers gathered. Once the trays were set, the maids receded into corners, ready to appear only if a goblet tipped or a plate required clearing. By night, their work did not end. The palace grew hushed, but bells still chimed, calling maids to fetch water, stir fires, or bring comfort to sleepless royals. Nighttime carried its own burdens. Shadows stretched long, echo magnified, and every movement seemed louder. A maid could feel the very weight of the palace pressing down upon her. Yet it was in these hours that the palace revealed its most secret face. The clatter of daytime disappeared, leaving only the faint crackle of torches and the sigh of night wind against shutters. Maids who moved through these halls spoke of a strange intimacy, as if the palace itself was whispering, companion to their footsteps. Friendship among the maids was carved in stolen moments. In the laundry rooms where steam rose and lies stung their skin, they could laugh together, sharing scraps of gossip, or recalling the villages they had left behind. Their camaraderie was bound not by leisure, but by shared endurance. A burned hand from the irons, a torn hem caught in the stair rail, a reprimand suffered unjustly, became part of the collective memory, softened by whispers traded over buckets of water or while folding sheets. Yet, despite these bonds, each mate knew her position was fragile. The palace was a world that consumed lives quietly. Youth and strength faded quickly in the endless cycle of bending, carrying, scrubbing, and walking unseen. Some maids left to married tradesmen, their years in service remembered only as shadows of grandeur. Others faded within those walls until new faces replaced them, their names forgotten by all but a few. And yet, in their time, they upheld a dignity not always visible to the glittering world above, the dignity of work unseen, for presence that kept the palace itself alive. To outsiders, the palace was a world of jewels and ceremony, a stage for power. But to those who pulled its cords and moved within its walls, it was a labyrinth where every breath had to be measured, every movement controlled. The story of the palace could never be told fully without them, though history's ink rarely spared a drop for their lives. They were the quiet keepers of order, the ones who ensured that fires warmed, linen soothed, meals glittered, and nobles lived in the illusion of effortless splendor. It is said that even centuries later, when the palace halls are walked by visitors, some claim to hear faint footsteps in the galleries, light and hurried, vanishing before they are seen. Perhaps it is only imagination, or perhaps it is memory itself, the echo of those who once moved unseen, their lives measured in bell pulls, in whispered footsteps, their existence a fragile thread woven into the grand tapestry of royal life. In the grand expanse of Buckingham Palace, where velvet-lined halls stretched endlessly beneath, the quiet gaze of oil portraits and the distant chimes of ornate clocks echoed through high ceilings. Another kind of space existed, one far from the golden edges of court life. It was a space not of ceremony, but of care, not of grandeur, but of gentle repetition. It was the bedchambers, and more precisely, the world of those who made the beds within them to the outside world. A bed is often a place of rest, but within the palaces of Queen Victoria, the bed was a stage of quiet ritual. Every layer had meaning, every fold held purpose, and behind each of these details was a maid who knew that her work, though unseen, was as essential to the palace as any crown or carriage. The morning began not with sunlight or song, but with silence. The chambermaid would rise before dawn, her shoes slipped on with care so as not to disturb the others. She tied her apron with practiced hands, lifted her bucket of kindling and water, and climbed the narrow back stairs, knowing every board that creaked and every door that needed a second tug. Her hands bore the map of the rooms she tended, not in notes, but in memory. She knew where the light hit first, which windows missed it most in the morning chill, which bed frames wobbled ever so slightly at the joints. Entering a royal bedchamber was not done with haste. She would pause at the threshold, eyes sweeping the room, breath measured. Everything from that moment forward was performed with a softness honed by years. First, she would draw back the curtains, not abruptly, but in stages, allowing the room to shift from shadow into light with grace. Then, she would tend the fire if one was laid, or lighted anew with coals carried from the scullery. The scent of smoke and ash would mingle with the faint sweetness of lavender sachets tucked into drawers and the sharper linen starch perfume that rose as she peeled back the sheets. The unmaking of a royal bed was itself a ritual. It's never a simple toss of blankets or flick of a pillow. It began at the foot, lifting the outer coverlet, folding it square, laying it gently on a nearby chair. Then the sheet, drawn back in a long, smooth gesture, and folded over itself in thirds. Pillows were tapped lightly, not fluffed, and set aside in pairs. The under blanket, thick with wool and often edged in silk trim, was shaken once, always, toward the window, never into the room. The mattress itself, feather-filled or stuffed with horsehair, was checked for unevenness, then smoothed with broad, even strokes of the palm. She would then leave the bed open, airing as the morning moved on, and return with fresh linen fetched from the laundry, white, crisp, faintly scented, folded with corners tucked in like origami. The sheets were unfolded with precision, allowed to fall across the bed frame like the spread of a tablecloth, and then tucked beneath the mattress using hospital corners. Taught by women who had made hundreds before her, the quilt was often seasonal, heavier in the winter months, embroidered, and lighter in summer. Each was carefully matched to the room, its tones complementing the wallpaper or carpet. There were rules about color, about texture, about symmetry. Every pillow had a place. Every crease was intentional, but beyond the visual was something deeper. The feel of the bed beneath the hand had to invite rest, to promise comfort without excess. Too soft, and it would seem indulgent. Too firm, and it would betray effort without ease. A balance, like so much in the palace, was quietly maintained. There were beds that saw daily use, by ladies in waiting, by distant cousins of the queen, by traveling dignitaries. And there were those rarely touched, except to be made and remade. Even these were not exempt from care. Dust would find them if left alone. Time would crease their folds. And so, week after week, the beds were turned down, shaken out, and laid fresh. Not for guests, but for readiness itself. Among the maids, the bedchambers were spoken of with a kind of reverence, not for their occupants, but for the silence they offered. Making a bed was a moment of solitude, a time to work without correction, to focus without interruption. The room would hold the breath of the night before perfume lingering on the sheets, the faint impression of sleep on a pillow, and the maid would smooth it all away, gently returning the room to stillness. And, perhaps, as she stood at the foot of the bed, hands at her apron, eyes sweeping her work one final time, she thought not of the one who would sleep there next, but only of the fold she had made just right. The way the light caught the edge of the linen, or the soft scent of lavender now rising from between the sheets. The rhythm of making beds at Buckingham was as much about memory as it was about motion. For the chambermaids, every room held a map, not written in ink, but in fabric, fragrance, and fold. Each bed, though nearly identical in size and shape, required its own particular attention. One mattress sagged slightly on the left, another creaked if pressed too near the footboard. A particular guest preferred a softer pillow at the head and a firmer one at the side. The queen's sheets were always tucked with the open hem facing outward, never inward, never askew. The linens themselves told stories, if one cared to listen. The finest sheets were woven from Irish or Egyptian cotton, cool to the touch, smooth as river-washed stone. Others were of heavier weave, intended for visiting gentlemen, for winter months, for the more remote guest rooms that saw only occasional use. Each had been laundered, pressed, and folded into the linen closets with care. Their creases were straight, their scent mild rosewater for the women's quarters, bay leaf or cedar for the men's. Before making a bed, the maid would run her palm across the mattress once more, not to flatten it, but to greet it, to feel the day's air in the room. She would shake the fresh sheet gently once. To remove dust, there was none but to let the cloth breathe before it was laid. There was something deeply personal in that gesture, though it was rarely spoken of. A seat, freshly shaken, seemed to sigh, falling into place with a grace that could never be forced. The bed was then made in layers. First, the undersheet, drawn tightly at the corners and tucked beneath with clean, practiced flicks of the hand. Then the top sheet, folded over at the head with a precise crisp-sharp, but never stiff. A woolen blanket followed in colder months, its edges aligned with care. Then a counterpane or bedspread, chosen according to the room. Floral for the queen's private apartments, deep burgundy for the guest chambers facing the east lawn, pale blue satin for the rooms favored by visiting children. Pillows were placed last, arranged with gentle taps and silent satisfaction. They were turned once after fluffing, ensuring no visible seam faced outward. In some rooms, a single cushion was placed in the center, roided with a monogram or edged inlay serving no purpose but to complete the shape. Like the last brushstroke on a painting, no creases were to show, no wrinkles allowed. The cloth must lie flat, the corners sharp. Bed was a canvas of order, a quiet statement that someone had cared enough to prepare peace, though no one often praised these beds. The lack of comment was itself a kind of recognition. If the guest slept, well, if the sheets remained smooth until morning, if the pillows bore no trace of discomfort, then the maid had done well. A perfect bed was one that went unnoticed. There were small variations in the routine seasonal changes, guest preferences, occasional adjustments from the housekeeper, but the core ritual remained. And in its repetition, the maids found comfort. The bed did not argue. It did not hurry. He did not ring a bell or bark an order. It simply waited to be made. Some mornings, especially in the winter months, a thin film of frost crept along the window panes of the guest rooms. The glass would fog with each breath, and the linens, though clean, felt chilled to the touch. In such cases, the maid would warm a flannel cloth by the hearth, fold it 3 times, and lay it briefly across the center of the sheet before making the bed, just long enough to soften the cold, just long enough to offer the promise of warmth to someone she would never meet. Even the most remote beds, those in the seldom used attics or the rooms reserved for traveling chaplains or retired ladies-in-waiting, were treated with the same care. Dust did not choose its corners based on rank, nor did creases bend only for nobility. A bed, to a maid, was a quiet trust placed in her hands. And she honored it fully, whether it belonged to a princess or a forgotten baronet passing through. The best maids developed a kind of grace in their movement. They did not rush. They did not pause unnecessarily. They turned, lifted, straightened, and folded with a flow that seemed choreographed, though no music played. Their aprons remained clean. Their sleeves did not trail. Even their breath seemed measured as, though exhaling too sharply, might disturb the order they had just laid down. And in this calm, one might imagine that thoughts drifted freely, of the family left behind, of stories half remembered, of letters hoped for. But more often, the mind followed the hands, focused, present, satisfied with the neatness of a corner, the quiet of a chamber, the soft rustle of fabric pulled smooth across a frame. Occasionally, a maid might find something left behind a hairpin beneath the pillow, a crumpled letter near the nightstand, a coin that had rolled under the bed. These were handled gently, never read, never kept. Returned to the housekeeper or placed on a silver tray just inside the dressing room. Trust, once broken, could not be mended like linen. And so, as the bed was completed, pillows plumped, counterpanes smoothed, side chairs pushed gently into alignment, the room returned to readiness. The maid, stepping back, would glance once at her work, not to admire, but to confirm that nothing was missed, that all was as it should be. Then she would turn, hands at her apron, and leave without a sound. And, perhaps, as the door clicked softly behind her, the bed settled once more into silence, perfect, undisturbed, and quietly waiting for the weight of sleep to return, as dusk crept gently across the Buckingham windows and the gas lamps flickered to life in the palace corridors. The work of the chambermaids eased into its final rhythm. The beds, by then, had long been made, dozens of them, each one carefully turned, tucked, and smoothed beneath patient hands. The rooms stood quiet, as if holding their breath, linen gleaming pale in the softening light. Yet the quiet was not emptiness. It was presence of care given, of order restored. Evenings in the bedchambers held a different kind of silence. Morning had its hush of preparation. Midday carried its gentle bustle. But evening was still. The doors remained closed. The beds, untouched since they were made, remained pristine. Only the maids, returning briefly to turn down the covers, disturbed the stillness. Turned down was a gentle act, half symbolic, half service, a sign that the day was done. The counterpane was folded halfway down the bed, the sheet pulled back, its edge turned just so. A pillow, sometimes misted with rose water or touched with lavender oil, was plumped once more, then laid softly on the side where sleep would soon settle. A small stool might be drawn forward near the hearth. A shawl laid gently across a chair. These gestures were not required by rule, yet they were rarely forgotten. They marked a shift from day to night with grace. Maids worked without commentary, The movements themselves held all the meaning. A final glance to ensure the bed's lines remained perfect. Check for the book left on the nightstand. The candle trimmed, the matchbox placed nearby. Then, as before, the maid would step back, hands still at her apron, and let the silence resume its reign. Some beds, those in the royal apartments or reserved for close family, held their own customs. The queen's bedchamber, for example, required more than precision. It required familiarity. Only trusted hands were allowed to prepare it. The sheets were always warmed with a covered warming pan before turned down. The footboard was checked for the soft woolen slipper rug to be aligned just right. A hand towel was folded in a specific pattern and placed on the nightstand. These details were never written down. They were passed from maid to maid, like songs, remembered, repeated, never questioned. For the guest rooms, there was no less care, though the occupants might change ambassadors, lords, courtiers, even visiting relatives from abroad. The standard remained. Every bed was a welcome, a gesture of quiet hospitality. The linen didn't speak, but it held a message. You are expected. You are safe. You may rest here in the servants' quarters, far below these chambers. The beds were simpler, but no less respected. Made by the maids themselves, Sitch her own before breakfast, and never left untidy. A narrow iron frame, a thin mattress, neatly turned, a woolen blanket, folded at the foot. Even in exhaustion, no maid left her bed unmade. The habit of order extended beyond duty. It was a rhythm absorbed into the body, like breath, like sleep. The beds of the palace thus formed a quiet constellation, hundreds of them, across wings and floors and hidden passageways. Each one tended, each one knows, each one gently holding its part in the silent architecture of royal life. And, though few outside the staff ever saw them made, the effect was felt. A guest might pause, briefly, before lying down, noticing the way the sheet folded away just so. A lady might admire the softness of her pillow without wondering who had chosen it. A visiting child might fall asleep instantly, never knowing the hours of quiet effort that shaped the comfort beneath them. This, perhaps, was the heart of the ritual, to create something that soothed without needing explanation, to offer comfort without applause, to make, remake, and unmake beds again and again, not for recognition, but because it was right. The older maids spoke of this gently, not with pride, exactly, but with familiarity. Their hands, now slower, still folded with the same grace. Their fingers still smoothed sheets with unconscious skill. And when they spoke of the beds, it was with affection. She liked a second pillow, one might say, remembering a duchess long gone. That room creaked in winter, another might recall. So I always laid the rug beneath the bed to soften the sound. These memories lived in cloth, in thread, in the corners of rooms that no longer echoed with names, but the beds remained. The work remained. The care remained. And perhaps, in the final light of evening, as the last bed was turned down and the last match struck for the bedside candle, the maid who stood in the doorway saw something few ever did. A room ready for sleep. A room not just arranged, but cared for. She stepped out, her shadow long behind her, and closed the door with a quiet click. And within the silence of the room, the bed waited, not grand, not proud, but calm and certain. A promise of rest, made by quiet hands, before the bells rang, before the carpets were beaten, the fires laid, and the silk slippers gently set beside the queen's dressing chair. There was a quieter hour, one not marked by elegance or formality, but by the gentle clatter of tin spoons, the soft crunch of heavy boots on worn flagstone, and the low hum of early breath in the stillness beneath Buckingham Palace. It was the hour of the maid's breakfast. Down in the servants' hall, tucked far from gilded staircases and velvet drapery, long wooden tables awaited. They were not polished like those upstairs. Their surfaces were grooved with years of elbows and plates, scrubbed with sand and hot water until smooth, but never shining. Above them hung oil lamps with wicks trimmed short, casting a faint amber wash over everything: the plain bowls, the dented jugs of milk, the jars of lard and salt, and the steaming pots of porridge that would be consumed without ceremony. Breakfast for the maids was a meal of function, not festivity. It was eaten quickly, quietly, and often standing if the hour was already short. Most days there was no talk beyond necessity. A nod here, murmured request for the sugar, a soft thank you when the cattle passed. Psh! Each girl came in with her own pace, her own silence. There was no gathering call, no clatter of chairs, just the gradual filling of seats, the brief scraping of spoons, and the slow, comforting warmth that spread from bowl to hands to belly. The porridge was thick, sometimes with milk if supplies allowed, sometimes with only water, a pinch of salt, perhaps a drop of treacle if it had been a good week in the kitchens. Bread was coarse and slightly stale, cut in uneven hunks from a large, round loaf. Tea was weak but hot, served in tin mugs with dented rims, and always appreciated more for its heat than its flavor. Some maids arrived, still wrapped in their shawls, their aprons folded over their arms, cheeks flushed from the morning coal run. Others came in with fingers already red from pump water or cloth wringing. Many had begun their day long before the rest of the palace stirred, lighting scullery fires, sorting laundry, hauling water from the courtyard cistern, or preparing the trays of toast and preserves that would soon be carried upstairs. Their fingers smelled of soap and ash, their cuffs damp, their brows still marked with the faint sheen of early sweat. But here, for a moment, they sat, not as chambermaids or scullery girls or silver polishers, but simply as women at the start of a long day. There were no napkins, no service, no silver, just chipped bowls, cracked plates, and a silence that wrapped around them all like a shawl. It was not an awkward silence, nor an enforced one. It was chosen, honored, a space of breath before duty, a pause before the day's many demands unfolded. Now and then, a senior maid might share a line from a hymn, spoken softly over her oats, or one might offer the last of her bread to a younger girl who had arrived late from a delayed task. Most simply, ate, spoon to mouth, eyes down, shoulders still. Sometimes light would shift through the narrow windows, high on the far wall windows, barely visible from outside the palace. A pale stripe of sunlight might fall across the tables, edge casting a soft glow on the steam rising from a bowl. One might see a hand curled briefly around a mug, holding it, not for warmth, but for steadiness. And in that gesture, there was something deeper than routine. It was endurance. It's quietly lived in the servants' breakfast room. The clink of tin on porcelain rarely rose above a whisper. Even the kettle's hiss, resting near the edge of the hearth, was softened by the layered hush that settled over the table like mist. This was not a place for laughter or stories, at least not in the early hours. It was a place for gathering. Strength not just in the body, but in the spirit. Each bowl of porridge carried more than just sustenance. It was a steady presence. It's the same each day, the same texture, the same heat. In a life defined by changeable demands, guests arriving without notice, rooms reassigned, needs emerging from bell pulls at odd hours, this one small meal offered consistency. The porridge might not be exciting, but it was reliable, and its quiet warmth, it held something that mattered more than flavor: certainty. The oatmeal was never fancy. The grains were soaked overnight in the kitchen's scullery, then stirred slowly at dawn by a junior cook's assistant. His fingers had long since toughened against the rising steam. A pinch of salt, maybe a ladle of milk if yesterday's deliveries were generous. Sometimes a lump of lard or a thin slice of dripping was offered for those assigned to the hardest duties of the day hearth work. Laundry, stoking, outdoor sweeping. These small additions, though humble, were accepted with gratitude. Some of the maids kept a bit of bread wrapped in cloth in their apron pockets, reserved from the evening before, and dipped it quietly into their tea. Others crumbled it over the porridge, slowly, methodically, stretching each bite into something more enduring. The bread itself was firm, with a crust that required work to chew. But its presence meant no one went completely hungry. The room had little adornment, just plain walls, a narrow hearth with iron grates, and 2 long benches on either side of the table. In winter, frost gathered at the corners of the small, high windows, and the stone floor stayed cold, even with the fire lit. Shawls remained draped over shoulders long after bowls were emptied. In warmer months, the windows were propped open slightly, with spoons or clothespins, letting in the scent of rose bushes from the nearby servants' garden, or, more often, the coal smoke from the kitchen chimneys. The table was marked with use, a faint scorch where someone had placed a too-hot kettle, scratches from decades of cutlery. The faint curve worn into the edge where elbows rested during quiet moments of pause. These were not flaws, they were layers of presence. The memory of other mornings, other hands. For the maids, this quiet meal was often the only one taken without standing. The rest of the day would be spent on their feet scrubbing floors, smoothing bed sheets, carrying coal scuttles, brushing gowns, drawing baths, folding linen, polishing glass, arranging flowers, and fetching warm water up and down narrow back stairs. The bell system dictated their hours, but breakfast was a realm outside of bells. There was no call for haste here, only a soft, shared understanding that this was the moment before the day truly began. Each seat had an unofficial owner. A tea, no one claimed them, but over time, everyone knew where each woman would sit. The older maids took the places nearest the fire, their joints stiff in the cold, their eyes a little slower in the early gloom. The younger girls clustered at the far end, where a sliver of sunlight sometimes reached the floor and caught the dust motes rising with the warmth of the kettle. Once in a while, a silence would be broken, not by voice, but by a quiet act. A girl would offer the last of her tea to another whose mug sat empty. A spoon would be passed down the table without a word, simply placed near a waiting hand. There was no expectation, just an understanding that kindness did not need volume to be known. Despite the stillness, the maids were never idle. Even in breakfast, their movements bore the discipline of habit. 8. Girl finishing her bowl would rinse it at the cold tap just beyond the door. Another might fold her napkin and tuck it back into her apron pocket for the next day. A third would help stack the mugs, aligning them by size and handle. Ready for the scullery to collect, the door to the corridor was left open, just enough to hear the distant chime of the first bella, soft ting that signaled the palace had awakened. The upstairs world had begun to stir. The moment of pause was over, and still, before they rose, many of the maids remained seated for just a breath longer, hands resting on aprons, eyes on the steam rising from a forgotten cup. The room held the warmth of their breath, the quiet of their unspoken thoughts. No one asked what they were thinking. Most thoughts drifted like the dust and fixed, ordinary, familiar. But in those thoughts lay a strength not often praised, the strength to begin again, to serve without noise, to endure without notice. So they stood, one by one. Bowls collected, scarves adjusted, fingers flexed. Tay passed through the doorway and into the turning clock of duty once more. The porridge would be made again tomorrow, the bread cut, the tea steeped. The silence would return, and perhaps within that soft, steam-wreathed hour, the palace was most itself, not in its ceremony, but in its quiet beginnings. As the first bell chimed faintly through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. The maid's breakfast room grew quieter still. The last few spoons clinked softly against the chipped bowls. The final sips of weak tea were swallowed with care, and the warmth from the steaming porridge lingered in the air like a gentle embrace. No one rushed. There was no applause, no flourish, only a slow gathering of strength before the day's many demands resumed. The bowls were cleared away with practiced hands, placed gently into battered baskets to be carried to the scullery for washing. Even in these simple acts, there was a measured care. Nothing was hurried, nothing careless. The worn wooden table was wiped down with coarse cloth each swipe, removing the faintest crumbs and streaks, leaving behind a clean slate for the next day. The cold dust clinging faintly to their aprons and the ache in tired feet were quiet reminders of the tasks already begun or soon to come. The chill that lingered in the stone floor below was softened by the fire that still burned low in the hearth. Gentle crackle, a lullaby to those who listened closely. The maids gathered their shawls, adjusted their caps, and prepared themselves to re-enter the unseen world of the palace, where footsteps must never echo too loudly. Hands must always be steady, and presence must be felt only as absence. It was a world where silence was a language, where shadows moved in harmony with the flickering candlelight as they filed out through the narrow doors. The faint scent of porridge, coal, and lavender mingled with the cool morning air. It was a fragrance woven into the very fabric of their lives, as constant as the dawn itself. No one spoke of this meal beyond necessity. It was a quiet ritual, shared but unspoken, a breath held between night and day. And perhaps it was in this silence, in this unassuming warmth, that the true strength of the palace was forged, not in grand halls or gilded chambers, but in the simple, steadfast endurance of those who began each day with oats, silence, and coal dust. The palace awoke fully now. Above, the gilded rooms shimmered with light and life. But below, in the stillness that remained, the memory of breakfast hung softly, an invisible thread, binding the many lives that moved within these ancient walls.